Hello, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Megan McLaurin, and I'm the programming coordinator at Interaccess, which organizes Vector Festival each summer. Interaccess is a gallery and production studio based in Toronto dedicated to supporting emerging and experimental practices in new media art. I'll begin by saying that at Interaccess, we oppose the violence and injustice facing Black and Indigenous communities, and we stand in solidarity in the fight against white supremacy, systemic racism, and colonialism. And we urge our community to recognize and stand up against systemic and individual acts of racism. I'd also like to recognize that Interaccess operates on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat, and is now home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. Toronto's in the Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. We acknowledge this treaty, and we remain critical of the ways it's largely been breached by settlers and newcomers, and at Interaccess, we commit to the work of renewed Indigenous sovereignty. In light of this being an online event, I know that many of you will be joining us from places outside of Toronto, so I encourage you to learn more about the Indigenous territories and treaties and languages across and beyond Turtle Island at native-land.ca. And today we are excited to present a curator tour and discussion about Dis-ease, Vector Festival's 2021 flagship exhibition, which has over the last 4 weeks taken place across a series of mail art packages and e-newsletter dispatches. The event will begin with a curator tour by Rea and will be followed by a discussion with the exhibiting artists, Stefana Fratila, Driftnote, aka Omar Rivero, and Racquel Rowe. Before handing things over to Rea, I would like to introduce her to you all. Rea McNamara is a writer, curator, and public programmer in Toronto. She's curated and programmed on and offline public projects for the Gardner Museum, the Drake Hotel, the Wrong Digital Art Biennale, and her work has been presented at the Art Gallery of Ontario and is in the collection of the Whitney Museum of American Art. Additionally, McNamara has written on art, culture, and the internet for Frieze, Art in America, Canadian Art, the Globe and Mail, Art F City, and more. Recently, she was the Emily H. Tremaine Journalism Fellow for Curators with Hyperallergic, reporting on digital feminisms and curatorial practices. So welcome, Rea. I'll let you take it away from here.
Okay, hi. Thank you so much, Megan, for that introduction, and really happy to be here to talk about Dis-ease, the exhibition, as well as then facilitate a conversation with our participating artists. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to shift to this curator tour, which has a I don't know, I don't like doing PowerPoints, so I had to do it to PowerPoint. Anyway, so I'm just gonna go and share my screen and go kind of really quickly through a bit of my curatorial background, sort of what brought the exhibition together, touching on the artist practices, and then components of the exhibition, because the exhibition, as has been discussed, is both a e-newsletter and mail art program. Yeah, so I'll just go into it. So let me go to my screen share. Okay, and here we are. Basically, this sort of slide to kind of start things off is documentation of an unboxing of a recent full-length album by the K-pop boy band BTS. B is an interesting album. It's one of the albums that came out of the pandemic, so I would refer to it as a pandemic concept album. And this unboxing kind of shows the print ephemera that is typically contained in K-pop album packaging. So you see pictured here the members of the band and a big poster. Surrounding the poster are different PCs, aka photocards. Photocards are these like literally almost like K-pop idol like trading cards that are contained in every album. You typically get one photo card. So when you open up a K-pop album, you don't know what kind of photo cards you get. And they're also generated by fans and exchanged by fans. So they're a form of print ephemera that is, in a way, kind of extends the gift economy and the sharing of fandom culture. And as I sort of spent a lot of the pandemic being a quote unquote member of ARMY, the fan name for BTS, and really being engaged with K-pop, I definitely was really fascinated with K-pop and its media fandom, especially BTS and ARMY, as kind of an open interpretive framework of visual content and meeting, and also a model of organizing for curation that was grounded in generosity and care. So I'll just kind of go a bit into my background as a curator, just to kind of give a sense of how, as a curator, you know, I'm somebody, how all this Spanish stuff relates, and I'll go into the exhibition. So I'm a writer, curator, public programmer. I'm someone who's really preoccupied with otherness, themes of otherness, hybridity, and specifically as it pertains to media fandom, I'm really fascinated with the collaborative processes of fandom and how that can relate or emerge in material and screen-based cultures. I write a lot about art, culture, the internet. So here is some slide or images related to one of my early curatorial projects called Shiros. It was a limited run event-based program that kind of bridged the on-offline divide. It convened artists, performers, musicians to explore the iconography and cultures of fandom that surround female musicians and artists. It ran from 2011 to 2012. This is a project that I was recently able to talk about for the first time extensively when I was recently doing a Emily H. Tremaine Journalism Fellowship for Curators with Hyperallergic, which I did from fall of last year to the beginning of this year. There's documentation here that you can see featuring gift documentation made by one of the key collaborators and participating artist, Lorna Mills, featuring gift works that were created by the artists that were basically projected in a club environment, because basically Shiros was a party night. So I'm a curator that has worked in a lot of atypical spaces, whether they be kind of nightclubs or venues. With this particular event series, you know, I was really probably one of the first projects where I explored fandom as a collaborative process that could be then a curatorial strategy. And below the documentation, because the event basically was these monthly parties. Every event we anointed a different female celebrity into the quote unquote League of Legendary Ladies. There's all sorts of different performances and DJs and voguing. It was very multi-sensory. And the top here is documentation from the cumulative festival that was organized by Whippersnapper called Virtual Season. And then below that is I was the curator, but also party hostess. So this is documentation of a cosplay performance that I did with the Canadian-Nigerian artist O'Shea. And that was for the Grace Jones event we did. Just kind of moving along, as a writer, I've been really drawn towards, you know, fan fiction, specifically Slash, really interested in the serialized nature of it and also its effective strategies. So these are screenshots from a commission I did for the Remain Modern, where I basically used shipping from fan fiction as a way to, it basically is a kind of autodidactic performative research kind of technique to talk about works from a Walter Scott exhibition. And then more recently, 2019, I did a kind of a viewing party of moving image works that engaged with fandom. That was for Pleasure Dome. To the left is audience picture. This was during the screening of Ji-won Choi's Parallel Lines, which was a work actually touching on K-pop. So there was a moment in the screening, where we passed around glow sticks, which if you've been to a K-pop concert, that's a very participatory element. And then to the right is documentation of just the print materials, because this event was done with in partnership with Broken Pencil. And so, fandom and fan fiction obviously is really grounded in zine making, and zine making is an alternative form of publishing, is kind of a way to think through alternate histories. So I guess just to talk a bit about the way the exhibition came together. So I was invited by Vector probably in the winter of 2021. No, 2020. What is time? Time, who cares? Basically, I was invited to curate the flagship exhibition. At the time, it was going to be an IRL exhibition. In early conversations, the exhibition, was always going to be responsive, and inevitably I knew that it was going to be engaging with the pandemic. That was a subject matter that when I was doing my fellowship for Hyperallergic, I was writing a lot about how artists and organizations were responding to the pandemic, whether through different forms of exhibition making or just the ways that the pandemic, especially the techno stress of the pandemic, really forced a lot of artists and organizations to adapt, whether it be through Zoom studio visits or creating, boundary making. I kind of showed this clip because, when I was really engaged with BTS and K-pop fandom, especially as this kind of multi-sensory, interdisciplinary commercial pop machine global. I was really taken by that in the lead up to the band's album B. They released these series of V-Lives and YouTube streams called #StayConnected. And they're all these different videos that they shared, like literally live, documenting the making of this album. And so this is a dance practice. It was recorded back in probably April of 2020. And basically it's just a dance practice featuring one of the members of the band, Hasok. I kind of write about this in the first dispatch. And I was really kind of taking with this about the ways, and this is in general with K-pop, how there's so much like ephemera that's shared in real time and distributed. And this ephemera, especially when you look at it from a performance standpoint, really kind of captures, and Michelle Choi, who's an academic at University of Toronto, talks about the kinetic intimacy that is conveyed in these documentation that is circulated, redistributed online of real life content, and how this real life content that is, put forward by K-pop idols, whether it's through these dance practices or selfies, how it cultivates like a parasocial connection amongst fans. And I was thinking about, with my participation in like K-pop, thinking of the variation upon variation of pandemic realities that kind of were created within that sort of community, which I felt was really a valuable experience, especially in the context of the pandemic and the cultures of misinformation, QAnon. Online can be a very polarizing space. And then I was thinking about the ways that today, especially contemporary artists with, digital practices, how their kind of creation and works are scattered across different platforms, whether it be Instagram or Twitter. And if you kind of are really engaged with an artist, the ways that your engagement with not necessarily the final product that ends up in a gallery, but their making of how how you as a viewer, as a participant, engages with that. So I'd say that like definitely the exhibition, you know, evolved from this kind of idea. Anyways, moving along, I'll also talk about, you know, this exhibition also was very much informed by the fact that Vector Festival is like a festival. So when I, you know, joined the exhibition, or, you know, when I joined and started developing the exhibition, I obviously, you know, went through a lot of the submitted works. So, but the beginning I knew it was going to be about the pandemic. Racquel was the first artist that I considered. So right now I'm playing their Washing Rice 2019 video performance work, where basically in a studio environment, you see the artist who's laying prostrate on a purple background, and slowly, it's about a 10-minute work, you're seeing grains of rice falling on her head and then over her shoulders. And when I saw this work, there's a couple of things that stood out for me about Racquel's work, which was this excitement of encountering another Caribbean artist. I'm someone who's Trinidadian Canadian. Racquel's an artist based in Barbados. I was also really taken by, you know, the kind of submerging yourself in the kind of gestures of food and tradition and making, and how you can be overwhelmed by those traditions and gestures. Because, and I think especially at that time when I was thinking about the pandemic, I was thinking a lot about in the pandemic, especially the early part of the pandemic, how we really rooted ourselves in like bread baking, like these chores that helped us structure our days. Or for myself, and I know we'll talk about later with, you know, especially with the work of Stefana Fratila, the binge watching and escapism, and the kind of retrograde nostalgia dive that happened there. So, so this was definitely one of this work by Racquel, kind of just that in the pandemic just kind of steered me towards what this exhibition could be. And then moving along, Driftnote, aka Omar Riviero. What's really another important thing was intimacy. I've previously to this exhibition, I was someone who worked at a museum where I coordinated really large scale public programming initiatives. The pandemic for me was not just about K-pop, but also reassessing my work as a curator and public programmer, my relationship to doing that work in an institutional setting, especially someone who does a lot of affinity space building and developing, and is really committed to steering experiential change through these spaces as a kind of almost decolonial process. So, you know, Driftnote, I really wanted to do something intimate and small scale because I had worked in such large big scales before, and I just wanted to do something that was very manageable and had a lot of care. So with Driftnote, we have this history, which I talked about in our dispatch, and there's something really, I wanted to, you know, with this opportunity, I was excited to kind of work and engage with an artist that I have a history with. I think when you have certain histories with artists and you've seen their work develop over years and you kind of grow up alongside them, or you see the ways your practices change, you have a way of kind of knowing their work that's a bit different and unique. So when I did a studio visit back in the spring with Omar, and at the time we thought this was going to be an IRL exhibition. I was really taken by the way that Omar has this very like interdisciplinary practice. I've known them as a musician, someone who works a lot with synthesizer. They came up from, you know, hip hop culture. Also, really interested in their engagement with avatars as a form of self-portraiture, working with 3D imaging. So up above, there's this 2016 work, which is a self-portrait, and you can see like this fleshiness that then really got, seeing Driftnote's, the work that Driftnote did and the 3D imaging they did for New World Order's Culture Capture Crimes Against Reality, which was shown at MoCAD last year, and Driftnote being responsible for turning, this colonial, just having to oxidize and melt in flesh and blood, definitely then got me like excited about embodiment. Anyways, I don't need to laugh. But also thinking about the way that in working in this present context is obviously pandemic, thinking about how we kind of archive our history as a person and how we sort of do that to speak to our personal experience with race and gender and culture. I guess this here just kind of represents the fact that when it was the third lockdown, that's when we made the decision to like pivot. I hate that term, but anyways, so when it became clear that we couldn't have an IRL exhibition, I was really trying to, at that time, a big part of the exhibition was like, I so wanted to avoid like a website and screen engagement. And it was really through conversations with Megan and Susan, but also my colleague and friend, Patty Johnson, that I really sort of thought, oh, like, this doesn't have to be a website. I don't have to sacrifice this intimacy. We could literally, make this be an e-newsletter. And then the combination of the mail art was like, okay, I still want there to be this experience and creating this space that is like tangible and real. Because I felt, especially coming out of the lockdown, that was something that, people were really struggling with. And also I was just kind of like, oh God, it's going to be summer. Like people don't want to look at their screens. Like I wanted to, and I also wanted to like the same joy that I got in getting a photo card in my K-pop album. How could I bring that to curation and art? Anyways, so then once that form kind of came together, I knew that I always wanted to have sound. And so Stefana Fratila was really exciting. I'm just going to click on to there's 2017 work of theirs, Derriere. Sorry, I feel like I had to pop out here, but here we go. So I'll just play this. So what was really exciting about working with Stefana is that Stefana I was aware of because a good friend of mine, Sophia, curated them, and I actually did on a tour where basically it's motion censored instrument that you kind of move through. So this is documentation. This was created in Banff in 2017. And these are actually 3D printed models of vapes that Stefana uses as like a way of managing chronic illness. And so what really excited me was this chance to work with a sound-based artist who was already thinking about how sound and space, basically. Okay, there. Oh, sorry. And I kind of knew, also I was really super intrigued by Stefana's work as a DJ and opening up and creating space for, other folks in the disability chronic illness community. When I was working at Hyperallergic and doing a lot of research around the ways that people were setting boundaries, what was really clear to me is that a lot of the wisdom around boundary setting, especially in a kind of immersive, always on environment, a lot of the wisdom and expertise is coming from the disability disabled community and talking about Crip time. So then all of that kind of then, pointed me towards, sorry, that was my alarm to be like, okay, you have to stop doing the tour, but there's more. So give me 5 more minutes. Anyways, So that's kind of like how we all got together. And I'm now just going to breeze through like the components of the exhibition. So the mail art component, which was distributed to Canadian subscribers, it would have been everybody, but we had limited resources. This was, again, like, as I talked about before, very much inspired by K-pop album packaging. This is documentation of basically the outward packaging, and also to the top right here, you see the package, the works that were contained. So this is actually documentation of all of the print ephemera materials that were created by Stefana Fratila, who's dispatch dropped last night. So everybody got, though, a mix-up of a pin, a postcard, and a post-pandemic writing prompt. Big shout-outs to Plume Pack, Linda Leonard, who was really genius in creating this packaging, which came out of just practicality of how do we shift these works, 150 editions safely, but also to Emma Takahashi and Rebecca Wilkinson, the designers who did the kind of graphic identity and even the sort of envelope detail. So yeah, this was kind of all of the kind of what was contained. And this is the glass pins. So I've actually done work with like pins before. I won't talk about it. But I was really excited to, with this, ephemeral material, how do you kind of reproduce moving image works in a kind of a tangible, wearable way? And so I've collaborated before with BBJ Pop Merch, Trixie and Beaver, who've done a lot of work within the Toronto queer community. So they, are kind of known for doing this like print, basically pins and stuff relating to pop culture, and I actually worked with them back in Shiro. So with these pins, so this is just showing, the pins that were created from top to left, Driftnote, Stefana Fratila, and Racquel Rowe. These pins are about like, okay, how do we capture some of the process-based materials that contributed to the works that were featured. And then these are the risograph postcard prints that were produced by Color Code, a local print studio. And this kind of just shows, again, like the different ways that the work came from. So like for the top left, Racquel Rowe, this was an image that they took when they were in Barbados from a video work. Similarly, Driftnote, this was a still from environmental research. And then with Stefana Fratila, whose project Let's Get Mortal was more this conceptual project, that postcard was more realized as literally like a quote unquote, party flyer. So the directions that the artist went were really great. And then the post-pandemic writing prompt was just kind of exploring, well, okay, how do we, get people to, or the subscribers to want to really engage more thoroughly with the ideas of the exhibition, but from the artist's perspective. So this was a later component. And again, credit to Emmy and Rebecca for their design work and Color Code for printing. And these were questions that when we were doing studio visits, the artists themselves were thinking about the pandemic and as we kind of move out of the pandemic. So that's that. And then quickly, the e-newsletter. This is documentation of some of the inspos for the newsletter. I have been a longtime subscriber of this British pop culture e-newsletter called Pop Bitch. And I was just generally interested in literally recreating like old school, like early 2000s, late 2000s, like e-newsletters and message boards, like that very like ASCII, black and white, Courier new font aesthetic. Also is very much inspired that when I was at Hyperallergic, I was covering different ways that organizations were doing exhibitions. So it was really exciting, FOFA gallery. And and just what they were doing. So I was really inspired by their e-newsletter that was happening. So this is still a screenshot from Berku Mek's work that they were doing, which was a script with like moving image with GIFs. And then this here is just some screenshots from just showing the different elements of the exhibition as an e-newsletter. So the header image, was obviously very ASCII. The writing, because it was an e-newsletter, and I'm sure we're all subscribers of e-newsletters, the writing, the curatorial language, shifted from being a very like, this is like 2,000 or 1,000 word essay of works in a white cube to, okay, like e-newsletters are very personal, first person, direct. If I was asking the artists to share their pandemic experiences and how their works were, created in that way, I had to also have some skin in the game. So that really shaped like the language. And then obviously the newsletter itself, so the bottom right features a screenshot of a tweet that was engaging with the Dion brand reference point. That was a key reference for the exhibition. So bringing in screenshots and of, tweets, of YouTube comments, bringing that kind of, different ephemera materiality into the serialized narrative. And then just like kind of nerdy pointing out that there was, even though this was like an online exhibition, I brought certain stuff like wayfinding. So the emojis, for instance, became the wayfinding and the kind of visual representation of each of the dispatches. So for instance, like with Racquel Rowe, the bread, with Driftnote, environmental research, the falling leaf, and obviously Stefana Fratila, and engaging with more like with the kind of hot facts summer, let's get mortal, the syringe. And I'm just going to exit here and I'll just do a quick scroll through of each of the dispatches and then we can open up to conversation. So this is just a quick scroll through the Racquel Rowe's, which for people who are really, keener, or, it was deliberately sent at 5:30 Saturday morning to coincide with when, Racquel's granny makes sweetbread. And so, so you guys kind of see here that, the video work is here and you click out and that's how you get to experience it. And sorry, I'm trying to move quick because we'll talk more about the works. Also, too, what was really exciting was bringing in past works. So these are stills from Untitled Cotton, which is another past performance. And so I kind of talked about in the past how this exhibition followed a sort of serialized narrative. So Racquel's was very much situated in early pandemic. And as I talked about, these kind of ways of like immediate survival and these kind of, age-old inherited chores and gestures that we engaged with. So then when we kind of move on to then, Driftnotes, Driftnotes was more about lockdown and that the escapism and the fact that we, all the artists for the most part, with the exception of Racquel, are Toronto-based. Toronto is, as we all know, the, longest lockdown, whatever. And so I really wanted to position, and then also too, like Driftnote created environmental research, which is an immersive 3D VR film. That work was originally released in the fall and follows this narrative, almost like a reverse kind of immigration narrative of their experience of coming to Canada. And this was like about, what was exciting about featuring this work was just really sort of thinking about temporality and the way that digital making allows, especially artists like that come from, different backgrounds, what have you, a way to approach the history in the present from, a kind of decolonial perspective. Hence the digitization of the cacao pods, the pearls, these colonial artifacts within the work. So sorry if I'm scrolling too quick. And this is going to be the last one, and then we'll talk. Anyways, last but not least, which one is the tab? Sorry, like damn tabs. And then this is the Stefana one, which, as I mentioned, just dropped yesterday. It was sent deliberately at 9 p.m. to coincide with when they have their Epsom salt bath. And this work was about their dive into... Oh, sorry. Oh, I heard someone talking. Oops. Okay. Anyways, so this is all, like, you see this, and I'm going to stop talking now. So this ends the, I'm going to stop my screen share. Okay. Oh, my audio was cutting in and out. Okay. It's better. Anyways, sorry. So why don't we kind of open this up then? And I guess I'll kind of open it up with a question to all the artists to, kind of maybe talk about, because we've kind of talked about this exhibition, how it's grounded in a pandemic experience, looking at post-digital art making, and looking at, the performativity and intimacies there. So I was wondering if each of you could maybe just talk more directly about your pandemic experience as artists, as persons. So yeah, I'm opening it up to the artists. I should wait before I start. I realized that I should formally introduce the artists. So I'm going to just quickly go through and formally introduce the artists. So Stefana Fratila is a Romanian-born composer, artist, and writer based in Toronto, Canada. She's also a DJ and co-founder of Crip Rave. Crip Rave Collective, an event platform showcasing just closing out my audio that was still playing. Showcasing and prioritizing Crip, disabled, deaf, mad, and sick body minds within safer and more accessible rave spaces. Stefana has exhibited, performed, and screened her work internationally, including at eFlux, Ars Electronica, Camius Triennial, and AGYU. She's also completed residencies at the Banff Center for Arts and Creativity, Waveform Transmission Arts, and CMAS brackets, the Mexican Center for Music and Sonic Arts. So thank you, Stefana, for joining us, and moving along to Omar Riviero, aka Driftnote. They are a musician and multimedia artist whose work is centered around improvisation, interactivity, audiovisual installations, and 3D imaging. They are interested in themes of cultural erasure, systematic oppression, race, identity in the African Indigenous diaspora. And then lastly, Racquel Rowe is a Black, queer, femme, interdisciplinary artist from the island of Barbados living in Canada. The notion of compulsory visibility and subverting dominant ideologies is essential to Rowe's practice. As a Black artist engaging in critical conversations around race, culture, and gender, has furthered her own ability to understand and break away from colonial representations. This process of decolonization does not come easy, even when work is created to challenge colonial and racist narratives. The critical language necessary to talk about the complexities presented does not always exist. Rowe explores the ways history has shaped modern day depictions of Black women, culture, and thus how these things affect her lived experience. And she considers performative action as a form of exploratory, open-ended research that is constantly evolving. Okay, there, I formally introduced you. Let's talk about your pandemic experience. Go. You need to turn your sound on, though.
I get. Oh, do you want to start, Omar, or should I go?
No, I guess
I can start, since I was the first dispatch and it's the early pandemic. As we're covering our pandemic experience, correct?
Yeah, you can also talk about your art, because like I know we talked about this, that some of us felt productive during the pandemic, some of us didn't. So talk about the pandemic as a person, as an artist, as an individual, as a creature, what have you.
Yeah, the pandemic is a creature. I mean, it was it was quite the creature. I think for me particularly, it was very strange and both fruitful and crushing in different ways. Like, it was super great to, the world is ending. Okay, I'm going home. Peace out, Canada. And to spend the next 4 months in Barbados and experience a different kind of lockdown and a different pandemic experience. I think that's been, I don't want to say important, but important in my practice to have had that experience and to have had the time to make work at home that I wouldn't have had otherwise. Like, I think the body of work that I've made over the last year or year and a half would have developed completely differently if I wasn't at home. Someone phrased it interesting to me a while ago, the difference between the work I make here that's always solo versus all the collaborative work I made with my family when I was home, and like getting to do that, and how much happier I look in the work at home, or how it has such a different feel to it. And even though it's all kind of under the same umbrella, and it's like, yeah, it's being in a comfortable place, it's being in a familiar environment, it's like I can step back and I'm not the matriarch. I don't have to engage in the same kind of way when it's like me singularly going at it. And I think that was not that there's like upsides to all of it, but that was definitely a positive experience despite everything else.
Cool. Thanks for sharing that, Racquel. Driftnote, do you want to pop in and share your experience?
Yes, I guess. Well, the pandemic sucks. That's the bottom line. And that's it. No, I'm kidding. I guess my personal experience of the pandemic was like, it reminded me a lot of like coming here to Canada, like being an immigrant and being isolated. So, and also like being autistic, I kind of keep to myself a lot. So then the isolation was it felt like now everyone's doing it with me. Which is kind of like a comforting feeling in a way for me. Knowing that everyone is sort of like home and things are canceled, I feel really happy when things get canceled. So that part of it seemed, very familiar, like being at home. But definitely there was a lot of like managing mental health, for example, and sort of like access to capital, like money, work. And obviously all of those things impacted my well-being, as well as like the people around me. A lot of my friends also, people who like have to be like in public events and that sort of thing. That really impacted a lot of different communities. So, and I feel like there was also a lot of like early pandemic, that I remember there was a lot of emphasis on Black Lives Matter as well. And so like everybody who wanted to all the quote unquote allies wanted to have the conversation, and like everyone was making statements. And I feel like that was also another level of like sort of stress. The amount of like attempts people were trying to make to show solidarity, and sometimes for the first time ever. It just seemed more like branding more than anything. Very like disingenuous, from in my opinion. But yeah, I think a lot of those things were like emotionally draining and like mentally draining. And also like I don't know, being in close proximity, like if people are living with their partners, like I've heard things that like that also increases like domestic violence, and like just there was a lot of things happening simultaneously that I think impacted people, and myself included. So yeah, like whether I was like trying to support friends through all of through those things, or support myself and support my work. And my work meaning just like paying rent, like not I don't mean like being in the cover of a magazine, and but yeah, and I guess like most recently still doesn't feel, I haven't been out all that much anyway, like I like to events or restaurants and things like that, like I like definitely I'll go to a park and take walks or whatever, and meet people at parks, but I still don't feel the difference. Now I know that things are opening up, but I still, I'm still like keeping isolated pretty much.
Well, thanks for sharing that. Stefana, do you want to sort of share your pandemic experience?
Yeah, I took a lot of baths, but that's par for the course for me. And what is not par for the course is watching a lot of reality TV, namely just one show, just Geordie Shore. I felt initially kind of excited because I felt like I could get away with staying at home and keeping to myself, which was felt kind of comfortable, especially just having years of having to kind of stay in bed for a week at a time and find a way to make the rest of the world kind of meet me there. It was actually a big relief initially to not have to explain that anymore, because everything was canceled for that first bit. And then as things started opening up in other parts of the world, I felt kind of like I was being gaslighted because we were still like well in lockdown here and stay-at-home order, and I found that section pretty stressful because I just felt like it wasn't being taken as seriously, or the health of other people, the community around people didn't feel like it was being taken very seriously by everyone, and that stressed me out a lot because I had been just concerned about being immunocompromised, those kinds of things. So it was just a bit of an up and down for me, and it was a huge hibernation period. It was not a productive time for me. It was pretty kind of sad time pretty much the whole time, but with a lot of really wonderful support as well from friends and
my partner. And the hardest thing, which I think a lot of people were feeling, was just not like being away from family or not being able to see family. I had a trip planned to see my grandparents, which I wasn't able to go on, and that was hard because I really miss them, and I still don't know when I can safely kind of go there and return without any kind of border issues. Yeah, a lot of reality TV. What can I say?
Yeah.
A lot of wanting to party also. Also new.
Right.
Also new for me, yeah.
I realized that, I mean, this is just between us and the artist, but I said when we were preparing, I'm like, okay, so I'm going to ask you each direct questions, and then we'll go into, and then I just like totally didn't do that. So, so I'm going to do that. So to get back to you, Racquel, because we've talked about how a lot of your works right now, especially the newer works that you created that were featured in the in your dispatch, really are engaging more thoroughly with oral traditions, and specifically the ways that these oral traditions and, you know, inherited knowledge sharing, the gaps and the ruptures in that passing of knowledge. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit about that, because I'm sure, you know, as you kind of talked about before, being back home in Barbados, being with your family, I think for some of us who have like a home that is elsewhere, we sometimes romanticize that like experience. And so I'm curious, like when you were then in the home and you only had a camera and a tripod, and sometimes it felt like, you know, you could only go to the grocery one day a week, you couldn't go to the beach. I'm just curious to talk about ways that there was a freeness to making the work, but then also the limitations and the kind of struggles there for you.
Yeah, well, that's a great point. It's definitely romanticized, and I have no shame in that. I mean, I guess being there, it was, I guess, just as horrible as here in its own way, with like, we had supermarket days and the beaches are closed and everything is closed and the supermarket's now closed and you just are eating what's in your house, and it is what it is, but that's my home at the end of the day. So yeah, it was both freeing to not kind of be in the environment that I work in here. And definitely at first it was very like constricting, like there's no lighting, there's no one to help me shoot. I have this crappy whatever. And I was like, I just still have to make work. I also didn't have entirely much of choice whether or not I was going to make some work. I was in grad school at the time. It was sink or swim time. There was like, you have to make some work, can't make nothing. So I think that also would have probably influenced the amount of work I probably made, would not have been the same otherwise. But where was I going? So I had such a thought and I've completely lost it.
You're talking about like making work and the limitations that you had to.
Oh, right. So I was thinking about the limitations of making work, but at the time I was also doing research, and I was like thinking about oral traditions, especially with the rice work and how I was going to go about that. And then it was, I've talked to you about it before. It was when I read Food Text and Culture in the Anglophone Caribbean by Sarah Lawson Welsh, is when everything really clicked. And she had like a really great section in the book on Barbados and oral traditions that were being lost already just due to fast food. So it was interesting to see that kind of pulled back during the pandemic, when like you couldn't go down to Chefette or KFC or whatever and just get a meal because they weren't open. Everybody had to cook, and everybody kind of had to return to these things, and it like gave me the opportunity to be like, whoa, I should learn how to make some stuff that I don't know how to make, and if I don't learn, no one is going to learn, and they're just going to be lost. I think that the work that I've made with my granny is also like, it's selfishly that it's an artwork, but it's also like an archive for me to have to how to know how to do something, and to know how to do something when she is in however many years no longer around anymore, and I can go back and look at those and attempt, even though even having a video isn't a full proof of how to do something, which I thought was really interesting. And is even small bits, like in other works, I have a work of my mom making something that her mom was teaching her, and it's like with oral traditions, I find not every single thing is relayed. So 10 minutes later, she'll call with other ingredients that she forgot. But, you know, like, it's just, I'll give it to her later and we'll see how it goes. And I like this idea of like, not withholding, but you giving the bits of a recipe a piece at a time, or because you're still like, that's like your thing and you're in charge of it, and you'll like pass it on as you see fit.
Yeah, it's a different kind of withholding, huh? When you get the recipe, but you don't get the recipe. And to kind of then shift to you, Driftnote, because you know, personal narrative and experience, and looking back on, you know, history, that was also a thread in your work, environmental research. And we kind of talked a bit before about how if you sort of follow the narrative of the film, it's this reverse immigrant story of, you know, it starts in Canada and the cold, you know, condo skyline, and then it goes to these really hyper real, fantastical, lush creations of Venezuelan environments. But then that is sort of a place in which you painstakingly create these different artifacts and ephemera. We talk about the cacao pods, the pearls, these natural resources that have been extracted and sometimes even you know, totally boomed and bust. And obviously Venezuela, especially right now, has a very precarious economy and present right now. So I was wondering if you could kind of talk about the virtual space and this propagation that you do through 3D imaging in these environments, and this propagation that in a way, you know, generates these living systems that really sort of play and challenge with our kind of notion of time and temporality.
Sorry, do you want me to talk about the process of making these things?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, maybe I can like talk specifically to the film. And I think like having like working in a digital media in 3D, it gives me like a chance to just have access to materials that I don't have money for. And so if I won like 1 million of something, I could, you know, put it in a photo or in a video. So having, yeah, that kind of accessibility, and also just sort of like in terms of location as well, like where the camera lets me also be inside of things or outside or underneath like water and all of these, you know, like things that are almost nearly either really expensive or nearly impossible to achieve on my own. So I think that kind of allowed me to like explore the abundance of some of these, objects like the cacao pod and the pearls, which were like really fundamental to like the colonial economy in Venezuela, and just how that that part of South America was exploited. And so like fast forwarding to the present, like it's a different story, sort of looking at the landscape and how resources are or are not accessible to people. And so 3D kind of shows me, like allows me to like show this like absurd abundance of something that had been there. And so and a lot of these things are kind of like taken from like photo images. I tend to like produce one of each kind and then create like iterations of that type of object. So like the cacao pod would have different sort of colors of maturity, but it's the same pot more or less. Similar with the tree, because the cacao tree also I had to build that from scratch. These are sort of things that like you can really like buy or find online, just because like the sort of the folk my interest is so specific, and even from like making the pearl shader, which is like how the pearls look, that had to be built from scratch as well. And so it lets me also like virtually like in some sort of metaphorical way explore how things could look like if I were in the environment as well. And that's where my avatar comes into play. And a lot of these things are just like things that I wish either I could be doing or I had done. So there's like a scene in the middle of the film where there's like an avatar dancing in like this sort of cacao plantation. So I would assume this is like pre-colonial time. So yeah, and that's sort of like my main sort of interest with 3D is sort of having like this surrealism of things like pre-contact and during colonization, and thinking about them or sort of bringing them to the forefront. In ways to try to like digitize, basically, like or archive, like in an archival way, like digitizing some of these records and events, right? So I feel like people like associate cacao and pearls with other things, to be quite honest, other than specifically with Venezuela, and then secondly, less with colonization.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, I feel like the way you approached it in the piece and the work, and especially as you kind of talked about like your avatar and your avatar's engagement in those spaces, and and yeah, these, and also the ways then that those crops then ended up, you know, as like the pin, as, you know, the postcard. Yes, my cat's here now. As the postcard. And like you talked earlier, this like abundance of, and this abundance of these resources that again happen in this sort of suspended space, which is, you know, present day, but also, you know, the past. And time has definitely been something that I think all the works here have a relationship with. And speaking about time, you know, and just to interject for the audience, that if you have any questions, we're happy to take them. Just let us know. We'll find out about them. But Stefana, with Let's Get Mortal, which, you know, is a popular phrase from Geordie Shore, which, if it's just worth reiterating, is a British version of the MTV show Jersey Shore. And the work that you did kind of comes out of, as you kind of talked about, your experience being a kind of background player in season 9, episode 3. And what I kind of loved about with your work is the way that through ritual, and love to hear more about it, and specifically as you talk about a Crip ritual, this sort of space that was created for mindlessness. And I was wondering if you could talk about that, because I know you talked earlier that the pandemic was very challenging for you as an artist to be quote unquote productive, and productivity and that sort of pressures around creation is something that I think a lot of us relate to, but obviously within specifically the, you know, disabled and chronically ill community is like a different thing entirely. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit further about that.
Yeah. Okay. Why don't I start maybe with Crip ritual? So the bath thing used to be a space where the bathroom is like my sanctuary, and it's where I spend like an hour and a half roughly a night, and I used to go in and I would like run the bath salting, and like I'd have no screens, and I would just try and like listen to like an audiobook or listen to music, and then I found myself feeling like incredibly stressed out during the pandemic, and I couldn't focus, and I had a lot of trouble concentrating on anything. And I also didn't want to listen to anything that mentions the pandemic. So that kind of really limited my options, to be honest. So that's where kind of the reality shift started peeking through. And so then what I had initially had is like a ritual around like resetting my body, basically, right? And then having like getting it ready for like bed, having like a couple minutes bath. That's why the bath is so integral. The bath has to do with like scalding hot water, you know, helping with inflamed joints and inflamed muscles. So that's the point of the salt in the water. And the show became so addictive because they were doing everything I couldn't do. And in a way that I wouldn't even do it or want to do it. So the idea of Let's Get Mortal, they say that to mean like that they're getting completely wasted and just beyond like into oblivion. Like it's a type of lifestyle that I cannot even imagine how their bodies are doing or accessing. And most of the cast members are pretty young, but not that much younger than me. So it's still like to see these like presumably able-bodied cast members just going so hard night after night. And the best part for me was just like seeing them so hungover the night after, which they party like about 3 times an episode, and seeing that even their bodies would show their partying like in the mornings and in the afternoons made me feel less alone. And also the kind of fantasy I felt like entering entering like the laptop screen that was like propped on the toilet. I was like, this is like so extreme, like everything they're doing, and here I am just steeping in hot water. Like I don't drink, so I was like, I have my non-alcoholic drinking option on my bath side, and there's something else so calming about not being wasted and watching other people embarrass themselves and slip on the kitchen floor and their puke like that, just like they're going so hard on that show. So there's something like about them being quote unquote mindless, but that allowed me to kind of enter the mindlessness as well. And the kind of idea I think of binge watching too, or like doom scrolling, that I think feels very mindless as well. And there was a point for me, at least during the pandemic, where mindlessness became like mindfulness and it became like really relaxing. And that became the new Crip ritual. Mindlessness.
Thank you for that. I have to say, when that dispatch dropped last night, I was like texting you because I was listening to the mix while I was doing dishes, and I was like telling you how I felt like listening to that 50-minute mix. I went from like going to a club to an after hours, and then ending up at an after hours, maybe ending up at the dealer's place. I mean, these are all like, I'm not doing these things now, definitely, but that kind of like the way like through a DJ mix, right? How the way in which pacing and timing and crescendo and feeling, like all that can kind of be in that. And I know Driftnote as a musician himself can identify. Just to kind of like, give a bit of a teaser, because the outro dispatch, which will arrive in subscribers' inboxes this Saturday, is definitely really looking more closely at time. And, we kind of talked about throughout the dispatches, this relationship with the present, with the past, the pandemic. People talk a lot about like how time kind of moved differently during the pandemic brain, all that stuff. So I was wondering if we could kind of like open up to talk about the ways that time has shifted for you, especially like in the pandemic and moving out of the pandemic. Because I think we've all kind of have come away from this ongoing experience with maybe greater sense of like boundary, maybe greater sense of boundary around our like mindlessness, or greater sense of boundary of like what we want to do. Because I know in talking with all three of you, you all generally were pretty kind of as tough as the pandemic was, and that I think I heard from all three of you being generally like okay that your social commitments, that you got to kind of be a bit of hermits and just not see people. But anyways, let's kind of open it up to this thing about time and how time, shifted, warped for y'all.
I really enjoyed when Driftnote was like, what did you say? You said that you really enjoyed when events were canceled and like that made you like light up. And I was like, I resonate with that so much. There's nothing I love more than, oh, we were not going out. Perfect. Anyways, thinking about time, I mean, as someone who is always late and doesn't really ever understand the concept of being on time, or that on time here is early, which I think is so strange. I think time is it's a construct, and I think it's like a tool of colonialism, white supremacy, and it's just kind of like, especially here in like Canada, Ontario, Toronto, like the GTA, it just feels it's very constructed to keep everyone going at a certain pace, and then there's all these other connotations that come when you can't go at that pace, you're unable to go at that pace, or you're running on a different kind of time. At least for me, I feel like nothing is ever that urgent. It'll get done when it gets done. And I don't know if that's a personal thing or a growing up on an island thing, that it'll get done or it won't. And we'll all still be sitting right here. So yeah, I think in some of my work and in my personal life, I definitely try to push against time, or the way time is constructed here, especially with being late. I think sometimes I'm actually intentionally late, which is probably not great, but I think in my own like brain, it's like, well, why do we need to like adhere to this and this? And I actually think it's not time, but I do the same thing with color. I find it very, especially in the winter, depressing here in terms of like the lack of color in the environment. So I like personally, in like all the work I make it a point to like use colors that I'm familiar with from home, and like things that stand out to me and are brighter, vibrant. I'm like looking at like the cacao pods and stuff, and the pearls in the background, and I'm like, yes, and like the pink from the fluorescent pink from the Geordie Shore sign. And I feel like those are like acts of resistance, and I feel like not being on time could be deemed an act of resistance.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think like also like time is elastic, and the clock is not, the clock is very linear, and I think like any kind of like act of resistance towards our linear time just like emphasizes elasticity for time, and considering like we do have to change our clocks and have daylight savings to make up for things, and we people try their best to be like in different time zones, and we know that time is not this one continuous thing, that it's linear and metric. So I'm here for all that not being on time either. Yeah. And I think like the pandemic has allowed for that in some ways, like people realizing that you don't have to meet in person. You kind of like have a chance to bend time a bit on your end. Like I was able, before this meeting, I was able to like cook for like an hour and then like just get ready like 5 minutes before. Like I could have never. I'm always like, that's why I'm late, because I'm like making a meal. You know what I mean?
As you should.
Yeah. Yeah. So, what was your initial question about? Did you say time warp? Is that what was that term you used, Rea?
Yeah, like time warp or shape shift.
Right.
Yeah.
That reminds me though. a little bit unrelated, but I also like appreciate Racquel, how you were talking about like food and like passing like oral history and passing down recipes. Because that like, you know, in some ways that's also like part of the work that I am interested in, sort of, yeah, like archiving some of those things that are important to me. And definitely food doesn't show up as much in my work, but it's definitely a huge part of my life. I'm making sure that like I am like learning things and recipes and that are kind of like, yeah, like are connected to have a history and then have like a community, and that's really important to me. And that was like in the film that was part of this exhibition. That was sort of like one of the questions, I guess, like you're sort of like, or I'm sort of like trying to retrieve information about myself and where I'm from, and sort of like give it another life cycle through my practice. So I'm always curious of like how far I can go into my own past. And that, yeah, so that's like something that I wanted to mention before when I was talking about the work that like digital, and maybe this relates to like time warp and shape shifting in some way, but like the ability in digital media for me to sort of like imagine transgressing time and and exploring how far is far, for a lot of the things that like I'm trying to explore in terms of like environment and like and artifacts and imaging and sort of, yeah, and reconstructing myself how long ago. Yeah.
If I can, I feel really similarly to you about time, and especially with your work, it made me think a lot about like history and like historical aspects to certain works, and it got me thinking. When I made the work about rice, I was thinking like historically about rice being like brought to the Caribbean as a region, and like things like that being cooked in the 1400s or whatever, and still cooking it the same way today, and like that tradition kind of being like timeless or continuing on. And then but yet I had a freak out at some point about a rice cooker, because I was like, I'm gonna forget how to cook rice like without it, and like thinking of time in that way as well as
Yeah, that's so cool because like, yeah, some of these, you know, like most people know it as like cassava.
mm-hmm.
That's probably more like the African word, but also like the name for it in South America originally was yuca.
Mm-hmm.
So like yuca is like that word's probably been around for 3,000 years. And the word like arepa, which is like something that you make out of either corn, you can make it out of cassava too, or yuca. That recipe itself, it's also been around, you know, it predates contact and colonization. So you can only imagine, and that was sort of like the starch. Like cassava was like the starch that a lot of people in the Caribbean were sort of like a lot of indigenous folks in the Caribbean, like the Tainos and the Caribs. Like those are the folks that like that's the sort of the crop that they were getting for carbs, right? So this is like a very old vegetable, and like the recipes are still around, and you sort of growing up, you kind of take them for granted, thinking that they're just like, this is just what we do like in our country. But that they like survived and like predate colonization. It's like amazing to me.
Yeah, I think also going like you're like trying to like maintain things and learn how to do things here. I feel like that's also an act of resistance, being able to say I'm going to go out and source all these ingredients and make this dish.
And also, like, you know, to sort of open it up, like, you know, the thing about your work, Driftnote, is the, you know, the sampling and you know, the sonic kind of environment, and how you play a lot, like similarly with the sampling of the cacao pods and pearls, like how that kind of manifests in the audio soundscape. And it makes me kind of think about sampling and you know, we talk about like kind of timelessness of certain ingredients. We also talk about like that certain sort of sweet spot of like a breakbeat, or and I guess I'm kind of bringing in like some of the aspects of with like time and you know, with Stefana and that kind of 4 to the floor, like these very kind of primordial counts or signatures. And yeah, like, and I don't know if this was something that you said, Driftnote in conversation, which was around like kind of recognizing kind of multiple time signatures, sort of people's like own circadian rhythms. I guess, like, you know, because we have some minutes left, so if anyone has any questions, they can dive in. But I figure that maybe we could just kind of quickly go around, because I realized that, you know, I was talking about this exhibition and how it came together and how it really came out of like this initial kernel of an obsession with a K-pop boy band. And I was just thinking about like pointless pleasures and obsessions as ways of like not just coping mechanism, but as you've talked about, Stefana, like as kind of coping ritual. So I thought like starting with Stefana and then going around, if we could maybe just share quickly like what's been like a pointless pleasure that you're in right now or you were in during the pandemic, and we can kind of, you know, end on that note.
I have a couple of ongoing ones. One is like I have a lot of colorful light bulbs in my house, so I get a lot out of picking the color for each room every night. And I love a lot of bright like daylight, but then after the sun sets, like I want it to feel like a club in my house. So I don't have any normal lights. I only have these very dim, like very warm dim lights, or these like club lights. So I like picking the colors. I find that really satisfying. And then I just wanted to add something about time. I feel like my sense of time has become like sectioned off into like 45 minutes or 23 minutes, which is the duration of episodes. Or like, how long is this movie? Like, I'm hugely into Letterboxd logging movies I see, and I'm obsessed with how long movies are or how short. And that's how I know what kind of night it's going to be.
Amazing. What about you, Racquel, real quick?
I've been an overbearing plant parent, obsessed with them throughout this whole thing, but they're doing really, really well. Amazing. And I watch a lot of Adam Sandler movies because I find his voice really comforting. And I have no shame in it anymore. I like openly tell people that's my thing. I fall asleep to it like that. Like something about his voice, I find it so soothing.
Oh my God. Amazing. And lastly, Driftnote.
I think like I make a big deal out of breakfast. I really take my time making. It's more like a brunch, you know, like it takes a while. It's like there's so many components, you know, and like I've been like pickling cabbage and making kimchi and like this thing called guarapo, which is like a pineapple cider. So I just like I've been pickling things, and yeah, I like making breakfast. So that's like one of my rituals, to the point where I usually, like, if I book things, I say I don't meet anyone before 11 a.m. and watching, like, I don't know, watching Drag Race, watching Legendary. I might not be at the club, but I need some of that club energy on the screen. You know, that gets me hype. What else? Yeah, I think yeah, that's like my and definitely, and this is a non-action, is like logging off social media. I've kind of like done more and more of that during the pandemic. Like I feel like I've gradually limited my access on the phone and social media. So that's another ritual of mine. Yeah.
Oh, well, on that note, thank you so much, Racquel, Driftnote, aka Omar, Stefana, for being so generous with your time and your work and talking about your experience with this exhibition. And just want to give a special shout out to all the folks that supported this exhibition, including especially Kanisha DeBreo, the programming assistant, who was a big part of making this exhibition and supporting it happen. Megan McLaurin, Belinda, Nada. I also want to give shout outs to Vibe Arts, Interaccess, all the other artists and folks that are part of Vector. Thank you. So I guess I'll just kind of drift it over to Megan for some final words.
Hey, thank you all so much. And thank you, Rea, for bringing together this really amazing group of artists. Thank you all so much, Stefana and Driftnote and Racquel, for being here today and to share a little bit more about your work. It's been really great hearing from you. And yeah, I also should thank our funders, the Government of Canada, the Canada Council for the Arts, the Ontario Arts Council, and the Toronto Arts Council, without which this event would not be possible. And yeah, if you enjoyed this event and you want to see more events like it, please do check out our website, 2021.vectorfestival.org. We're running events until August 8th, so I highly encourage you to check them out. And yeah, thank you all again so much in the audience for joining us this evening, and to our wonderful panelists. Thank you.